Winter has never really been my season. After the rich colours of autumn fade away, everything just turns grey and quiet. Every now and then you get snow-covered forests, but they never really seem to last very long. So this year I started thinking, what if I could create little slices of my favourite pieces of nature? Something to escape to when everything outside feels a bit lifeless. So just like the animals preparing for colder months, I'm setting up a cozy new corner in my studio with all of my favourite biomes. And I'm starting with a lush green, grassland style mountainscape using a type of hardscape material that I don't think any of you would have seen before. For the past few years, I've mostly stuck with simple setups and cheap tanks. Nothing fancy, and I usually get them put together by a local glass company. They've always done the job, but this time around I felt like doing something a little bit different, something more refined. So I picked up this 240 litre Opti-White tank with super clean edges and no visible silicone. And going into this build, I already have a pretty clear idea of what I want to create. It's actually something I experimented with a few years back, but on a much smaller scale. A tiny 19 litre tank using a few kilos of glass. This time though, I'm upscaling it by a lot, using about 50 kilos of glass and this massive tank. I first came across this hardscape material completely by accident as I was visiting a local landscaping place. One of the spots that typically sells rocks and gravels for gardens. And tucked away in one of the back corners, they had this huge pile of slag glass, basically waste glass from a manufacturing process. I have no idea why they had it here, but it looked pretty cool, so I grabbed a bit. Since I knew this was going to turn into a pretty big project, I reached out to Invitel to see if they were interested in supporting the build, and thankfully they were, which was pretty cool, and they sent over a ton of gear to help bring the whole project together. And because I was about to start dropping in some large chunks of glass into this brand new tank, I figured I'd play it safe. I recently bought a new washing machine, so I kept the styrofoam packaging from that and used it as a protective base to help ease some of my nerves. Even though I'd be adding plenty of substrate later on, it still felt like one of those risks that wasn't worth taking. On top of the foam, I added a generous, probably excessive amount of deep bases, more than I realistically needed. But the idea is to keep this tank running for a very long time, so I wanted a really solid foundation with plenty of nutrients. Something that would support root growth and help everything settle into a proper ecosystem over time. It smells exactly like digging into a damp rainforest soil environment, which is strangely satisfying. This is where I realized my mistake. After pouring in a few bags, it became pretty obvious that the front edge of the styrofoam was going to be awkward to hide. So I ended up carving it back at a sharp angle, which obviously turned into a total mess, with tiny bits of foam everywhere in the tank. Thankfully though, the foam is so light, the vacuum handled it perfectly and picked up all of the loose foam without disturbing any of the substrate. Once that was sorted, I covered everything with a couple of bags of contra soil. There's something about leveling it out that's extremely satisfying. Then came the part that I'd been kinda dreading, lifting the glass into the tank, and trying to figure out a layout that actually worked. The glass itself isn't sharp, as some of you might be expecting, but there are some small burrs here and there that could definitely cause some issues. So before anything went in, I went over each piece of glass with some sandpaper, just to smooth everything out, especially with fish in mind. I don't want anything delicate getting hurt on rough edges. I also don't have a huge amount of this glass to work with, just a few really big pieces, so the goal here is impact. 2 main pieces and a few smaller pieces to support the main structure. As usual, getting the layout right took time, a few days actually, setting it up, walking away, coming back and sitting in front of it for a while. If something feels off, you'll notice it, and if you can go a full 24 hours without wanting to tweak something, then you know it's going to be good. That said, right now the left and right sides are a little bit too symmetrical, but I'm not too worried about that as the plants will break up those lines over time. Now I should probably talk about the lighting I'm going to be using. There's a ton of different lighting options available, but this time around I went for the Skylight Foqal 120. It's clean, minimalistic, and it's the exact look I'm going for. Plus I've already got a few other lights from Skylight, so I don't need to get another extra app to control all of the lighting. For filtration I'm using an Biomaster 350 Thermo, though I probably won't even need to use the heater unless the room drops somewhere below 20 degrees Celsius, which almost never happens here. Everything else is fairly straightforward. I'm sticking with the stock media in the filter for now, but I am swapping out the standard tubing for some silicone stuff. It's way more flexible and just way easier to work with. I'm also using glass Lilly pipes with a built-in skimmer just to keep the surface clean and the flow looking nice and natural. Since I'm planning on using some more demanding plants in this setup, I've also added an inline CO2 diffuser. This tucks neatly into the outflow tubing, so there's no extra clutter inside the tank. And then there are the doses. Really simple bits of equipment. They don't need apps, they're simple to set up. You just connect them to a timer, set the amount you want to dose, and that's it. The only real downside to these is that you can't schedule different days unless you're using a Wi-Fi timer. But for something this straightforward, it's no big of a deal. You can just spread the dosing out in smaller amounts over the entire week. With the technical stuff out of the way, it's finally time to start bringing this thing to life. As I mentioned earlier, I'm aiming for a grassy open landscape, so I've gone all in on that theme. Before planting though, I always like to mist down the tank and the substrate because planting into dry aqua soil is way more difficult. For the foreground, I'm using a pretty classic mix, Glossostigma, Monte Carlo and dwarf hairgrass. Just placing them in loose patches across the front and mid-ground with no strict structure, just letting it feel as natural as possible. There was also a random pot of Hygrophila tiger in the box, so I figured why not. So we'll see what it looks like once the tank grows in. I also picked up some Blyxa japonica, which should help soften some of the more rigid edges of the glass and break up some of the symmetry that's hanging around the two edges. The main carpeting plant in this is going to be Monte Carlo, and I normally use tissue culture cups for this, but this time around I used the mats instead, and I used half as much as I actually ordered. And once you rip the Monte Carlo off the surface, you could pretty much reuse it as a base to grow another batch if you wanted to. Before moving on to the taller plants, I partially filled the tank just to make planting a little bit easier. Since this tank is 240 litres, I upgraded my RODI system, which has made a huge difference. My old one would have taken about 2 to 3 days to fill this tank up. This new one though, it can get done in 3 to 4 hours max. It's not the most pretty thing to look at, but it gets the job done. It gets the TDS down to 0, and it has a higher percentage of clean usable water than wastewater. With some RODI filters, you end up with a lot more waste than usable water. To finish off the planting, I added a large batch of Cyperus helferi, along with some Eleocharis, acicularis scattered around the sides and mixed through the middle. I was hoping to include some Eleocharis montevidensis as well, but unfortunately it was out of stock at pretty much every supplier I could find. So that might be something I'll add at a later date. Every aquascape starts off the same. It always gets ugly with the arrival of algae, starting with diatoms and green spot algae. They surge in quickly, coating every available surface in a brown slime. And more often than not, they don't arrive alone. Blackbeard algae and staghorn algae also creep in, especially in areas with high flow when you're blasting CO2. As unsightly and disheartening as this is, at the same time bacteria colonies begin establishing themselves across the tank, forming the invisible foundation for the future ecosystem. In the weeks that follow, species that specialize in algae warfare begin to arrive. The first creatures to be unleashed are snails. These thick-shelled, heavily armoured, tiny little grazers slowly roam the grasslands, scraping algae from every surface using rows of raspy little teeth. They'll clean the rocks, the glass, the wooden plants, and all of the really hard to reach places. But while the snails are excellent at dealing with hard surfaces and tight spaces, they're slow and not especially well adapted to working around plants and grasses that sway in the current. For that, a specialist is required, the Otocinclus catfish. These guys are some of the friendliest and hardest working fish in the entire hobby, and they're also super cute. Unlike their counterparts, the snails, Ottos move quickly and effortlessly between every surface in the tank, gently scraping away algae without damaging the plants themselves. And they're particularly fond of grassy species like Cyperus helferi and Eleocharis species. And this is where they spend a lot of time grazing for algae. When they get tired, they use their little fins to grip onto the surface, and sometimes it looks like they're levitating. Despite spending almost every waking moment feeding on algae and biofilm, it's still super important to supplement their diet every so often. Since they're so hyper-efficient, Otocinclus can quickly exhaust their natural food source and slowly starve to death. The final component of the cleanup crew to be introduced to their new home are these wild-type Neocaridina shrimp. This initial wave of shrimp are the toughest and hardiest of all the shrimp that I care for. If they successfully adapt to life in the grasslands, they'll be joined by some nice blue dream shrimp as well. While these wild-type shrimp aren't all that popular because of their lack of colour, I personally find myself drawn to them just as much as any of the other species, because if you look at them really closely, you can see their entire internal process working over time. Everything that goes in one end comes out the other end in what seems like only a few seconds. And even despite the generations of selective breeding, Neocaridina genetics are still wonderfully chaotic, and every now and then, even these clear shrimp will produce something completely unexpected. It's one of my favourite parts about keeping them. The first few waves of life added to the tank all filled specific niches and functions. However, the next few species are essentially cosmetic additions. Sure, they'll add nutrients to the biosphere, but their primary purpose is to add movement to the tank and bring life to the midwater and surface environments. So to keep the scale of things as impactful as possible, I've chosen 3 nanofish species that all complement each other in different ways. The blue-eye rainbow fish will spend most of their time in the upper portion and surface area of the water column, while the least rasboras will drift around the midsection, leaving the emerald rasboras free to hunt through the carpet for tiny little shrimplets. Five weeks later, the tank is progressing exceptionally well. The cleanup crew have the algae situation under control, and the plants have started to power along. Though I'm still not quite happy with the transition between the background plants, so I'm going to add some Juncus Repens in a few spots along the back of the tank, primarily in the corners. This will add a little more texture and help transition things a little bit better, since I still can't find any Montevidenses. Since I already have my hands in the tank, it's time for the first big trim as well. The tank's looking great, but I need to convince the carpet to grow sideways to fill all of the gaps rather than growing upwards. As you can see, the Monte Carlo is dominating the space, though the Glossostigma should eventually stand its ground and push back a little bit. This is quite a time-consuming process, but it's also relaxing as well. After hacking everything back, it's always really cool to see the plants pearling and releasing oxygen into the water from their fresh wounds. Looking at the final results of the tank from day 1 of planting until these final shots, you wouldn't believe it's only been 55 days, a little under 2 months. I had to double check the dates myself because I'm honestly surprised at how fast everything has grown. Though admittedly, I was blasting the CO2 pretty heavily early on. Let me know what you think of the final results, and make sure to subscribe because I've got 4 other big biome projects in the works to tie this space together.